They sold Nashville the perfect power couple. But that was a lie. Their marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a 10-year battleground. On one side was Hank Cochran, poet, teacher, a possessive genius. On the other side was Jeannie Seely, warrior, revolution, uncontrollable force. And on that battlefield, only one could win. This wasn't a love story. It was the autopsy of a war disguised as a marriage. We cannot begin in Nashville. We must go back to the two very different, very lonely paths that led them together. Our first path begins where the first scars were made, in a place born of dirt and despair, Isola, Mississippi, August 2nd, 1935. As the Great Depression gripped the nation, Garland Perry Cochran, whom the world would later call Hank, was born. He was the son of a poor farmer, and from the start, fate seemed determined to crush him. In 1938, at the age of 3, little Garland was struck by a severe combination of illnesses. It wasn't a disease, but a full-blown invasion. Pneumonia, whooping cough, measles, mumps. They came all at once, attacking his tiny body. Doctors, with the grim reality of the times, made a prediction. They told his parents that the boy would not live past his teens, growing up not only with the memory of fever, of pain, but also with the knowledge that you were a child living on borrowed time. The wound never healed. It became a core part of Hank's identity. It instilled in him a reckless disregard, a sense that every day could be his last. But ironically, it also left him with lifelong health problems. His immune system was permanently damaged, a silent weakness that would come back to haunt him in his most glorious years. But illness was only the first enemy. The second, and perhaps even more cruel, enemy was family. In 1944, when Hank was 9, his parents divorced. In the world of 1940s Mississippi, divorce was more than a legal separation. It was a breakdown of the cosmic order. The family structure, the only lifeline in a world of poverty, was shattered. Hank followed his father to Memphis, but salvation was not there. Instead, he faced one of a child's worst fears: institutionalized abandonment. He was sent to an orphanage. We need to stop here. Orphanage is more than a word. For a 9-year-old boy, orphanage is a sentence. It's a public confirmation that he belonged to no one, a profound loss of identity, reducing him to just a number in a ledger. Hank Cochran wasn't a resigned child. He was a fighter. He ran away, not once, but twice. Imagine the courage or desperation it took. A 9-year-old boy, alone, escaping the walls of abandonment, preferring to face the uncertainty of the outside world rather than accept the fate of an orphan. After 2 escapes, he finally found a fragile shelter with his grandparents in Greenville, Mississippi. But his world was permanently damaged. He learned a core lesson: nothing lasts forever, and stability is fleeting. It was a temporary illusion. It was this chaos, this desperate yearning for a family he could never have, that became a neurosis that would destroy him later, leading him through 5 failed marriages. His adolescence wasn't about football or dance. It was about survival. He witnessed the abject poverty of the countryside. He learned guitar from his Uncle Otis, and it quickly became his only companion, his only ticket out of reality. As soon as he could, he ran away. He hitchhiked to New Mexico working on oil rigs. This wasn't romantic work. It was dangerous, dirty work for people with nothing to lose. He was a teenager doing a grown man's job, trying to prove something to a world that didn't seem to care. He returned to Mississippi, then to California, where he worked as an olive picker. Every mile, every labor job, and every night sleeping on the side of the road was shaping his unique poetic voice. He wasn't only learning to work, he was learning to observe. He listened to broken men in bars, weary wives on farms. He collected the fragments of broken lives. These isolated experiences were forging a unique poetic voice. Lonesome Heartbreak wasn't an artistic choice for Hank Cochran. It was his native language. In the 1950s, when he was 16, he decided to bet on music. He went to California, but glory didn't wait for him. He worked at Sears Roebuck, a menial, almost hateful job, just to pay the rent. He enlisted another attempt to find structure or perhaps another way to escape. Then he had his first significant opportunity. He met another young man named Cochran, a talented young rockabilly musician named Eddie Cochran. They were not related, but they shared a dream. They formed the duo Cochran Brothers. This was Hank's first opportunity. They recorded demos, played music wherever they could, but the world wasn't ready for them, or maybe they weren't ready for the world. The demos flopped. Music didn't pay the bills. This failure, this premature failure, was more bitter than the oil rig job. It reaffirmed his deepest fears, that he wasn't good enough, that he would be forever trapped in the poverty he had tried to escape. But even in his failure, Hank was building. He was learning. He taught himself to write songs, not from books, but from dissecting his heroes. He listened to Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell. He learned how they turned a complex emotion into a simple, razor-sharp phrase. He was shaping his songwriting style from his own experiences of labor and failure, and he was also learning to hide. This was one of Hank Cochran's first and most important secrets. He realized that the world did not love victims, so he created a myth. He never spoke of the coldness of the orphanage. He did not talk about the shame of being abandoned. Instead, he began to fabricate stories about miraculously surviving childhood illnesses. He made himself a miracle, a chosen one. He turned pain into power, not by healing it, but by concealing it behind a crafted persona of mystique. According to the Country Music Hall of Fame, it was this concealment, this rejection of the victim image, that became the source of the astonishing resilience of his songs. He didn't write about being a victim. He wrote about surviving being a victim. In the late 1950s, Hank Cochran was a bundle of contradictions. He was a 20-year-old survivor with 60 years of scars. He was a raw talent honed by rejection. He was a man obsessed with stability but unable to stay put. He was ready for Nashville. He was ready to write his own drama, and Nashville was the only place in the world that would pay for it. Our second journey begins in a different, but no less difficult world. Titusville, Pennsylvania, July 6, 1940. Marilyn Jean Seely was born, the youngest of 4 children in a poor farming family. Like Hank, she grew up in the shadow of poverty. Her father worked in the steel mills, a tough job, and played banjo at square dances to earn extra money. Her mother sang ballads. But there was one important difference. While Hank's family was broken, Jeannie's family was united by music. Jeannie's pain did not come from neglect, but from judgment. Every week the family gathered around the radio tuned to faraway Nashville, listening to the Grand Ole Opry. For Jeannie, it was more than entertainment. It was a church service. Country music with its stories of real life was a fundamental part of her identity. But in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in the 1950s, country music was not considered art. It was considered hillbilly music, backward and shameful. When Jeannie began to sing, she did not receive compliments. She was teased at school. Imagine a little girl with a heart full of Roy Acuff and Kitty Wells melodies, walking down the school hallway and being called a hillbilly. That shame might have discouraged her. But for Jeannie Seely, it only strengthened her resolve. It created an inferiority complex, yes, but it also turned her shame into armor. It instilled in her a desire not just to be accepted, but to stand out, to prove that the music they mocked was truly a treasure. Jeannie's talent was undeniable. At just 11, she was singing on radio station WMGW in Meadville and appearing on television in Erie. She had more than talent. She had brains. She graduated from Townville High School in 1958 as an honor student and a cheerleader. Her path seemed destined for a normal, secure life. She worked as a clerk at a local bank. She even attended the American Banking Institute. She was smart, responsible, and utterly dissatisfied. The banking life was not for her. The call from Nashville radio was too loud. So in 1961, at the age of 21, Jeannie did something few women of her time dared to do. She got into her MGA Roadster, alone, and drove to California. The journey was not easy. It was like a metaphor for her future career. She was caught in a snowstorm on Easter. A Pennsylvania girl alone in a sports car stuck in the snow trying to get to Hollywood, but she didn't turn back. She went to California and began a double life. By day, she was a competent office worker, working as a secretary at Imperial Records in Beverly Hills. She was right in the heart of the industry, but behind the scenes, she typed memos, arranged appointments, and, most importantly, she listened. She learned how the industry worked from the inside. By night, she was a singer, performing at Hollywood Jamboree, trying to get noticed. But here's what made Jeannie Seely different. She didn't just wait to be discovered. She created opportunities. And she wasn't just a singer. She was a songwriter. In 1964, she began writing songs for Four Star Music. And this was one of her big secrets, one she kept hidden for decades for fear of being seen as a gimmick. As a teenager, she recognized the talent of a young, eccentric musician named Randy Newman. As she recounted in Ken Burns' 2019 documentary, she tracked him down, convinced him to collaborate. The result? Anyone Who Knows What Love Is. That song was recorded by R&B legend Irma Thomas and became a pop hit. Think about that. Before she had a country hit, Jeannie Seely co-wrote a classic R&B/pop hit with Randy Newman. She also co-wrote Senses with another legend, Glenn Campbell, which Connie Smith later included on her album. Her talent was undeniable, but the industry still tried to reject her. She signed with Challenge Records in 1964 and released a series of singles. If I Can't Have You, A World Without You, Today Is Not the Day. They were all great songs. They were even recorded at Nashville's legendary RCA Studio B, but they all flopped. Nashville labels turned her down. The reason? In a brutal moment of industry honesty, an executive told her she wasn't pretty enough. Not pretty enough. Hillbilly. The taunts from the Pennsylvania schoolyards were now being echoed by Nashville's gatekeepers. They wanted blondes in gingham dresses. They didn't know what to do with a woman with a powerful voice, a sharp wit, and a nonconformist beauty. Jeannie Seely, in 1964, was a trailblazer running out of options. She had proven herself as a songwriter, a singer, a self-made woman. But she was losing the battle against sexism and image. She was in California broke, disappointed, and rejected. She needed a mentor. She needed someone who believed in her. Meanwhile, in Nashville, Hank Cochran had just arrived in town. He was no longer a West Coast loser. He was a song plugger ambitious for pamper music. He was a man with a notebook full of songs drawn from his own painful experiences. In 1960, he took a bet with an eccentric musician friend, a man named Willie Nelson, and convinced his boss to give him a raise. And in 1961, he and his friend Harlan Howard wrote a song about a broken heart that can't let go, a song he wrote with painful honesty about his own abandonment. It was called I Fall to Pieces. Patsy Cline recorded it, and it became a massive, influential #1 hit. Hank Cochran had arrived. He was the new king of heartbreak ballads. Two paths, one forged in abandonment and illness, the other in ridicule and resilience, were now ready to intersect. Hank is preparing for a West Coast tour where he meets a young, powerful singer singing at a Hollywood jamboree. A world is about to be created, and a world is about to be destroyed. The year is 1965, the West Coast. While the Beatles are invading from across the Atlantic, Hank Cochran is royalty in his own right, a king of the countrypolitan sound, touring on the strength of songs that had become American standards. He is the man who gave Patsy Cline I Fall to Pieces and She's Got You. He is the man who saw the outlaw spark in Willie Nelson and pulled him into the Nashville fold. He is a man whose opinion matters. On this tour, he finds himself at a Hollywood jamboree, a local showcase of hopefuls. And on that stage, he sees her. He sees Jeannie Seely. He doesn't just see a pretty girl singing a country song. He sees something that the Nashville executives, in their blindness, had missed. He doesn't see the woman they called not pretty enough. He sees the Pennsylvania farm girl grit. He hears the California hustle resilience. And most importantly, he hears that voice. It wasn't the clean, soaring soprano of a Kitty Wells. It was something else. It was textured. It was raw. It was filled with the soulful, bluesy phrasing she had learned from Irma Thomas and the R&B records she secretly loved. It was, in a word, honest. It was a voice that didn't just sing a sad song. It was a voice that conveyed authentic hardship. For Hank Cochran, a man who wrote lyrics steeped in psychological pain and adult-sized heartbreak, this voice was not just a voice. It was a vehicle. It was the perfect instrument to carry the weight of his words. After the show, he approached her. He didn't offer empty compliments. He offered a prophecy. "You don't belong here," he told her. "Your voice, it's a Nashville voice." He gave her the promise that every hopeful in that room was desperate to hear. "Come to Nashville. I'll help you." For Jeannie, this was more than an offer. It was a crucial opportunity. She had been rejected, marginalized, and told her look was wrong, her sound was wrong. And now, one of the most powerful men in the industry had looked at her and said, "You are right." She didn't hesitate. She packed her bags, left her secretarial job at Imperial Records, and pointed her MGA Roadster east. She was betting her entire life on the promise of one man. When Jeannie Seely arrived in Nashville in 1965, she was not just another girl with a guitar. She was Hank Cochran's protege. This had mixed results. It opened doors that had been slammed in her face, but it also immediately put her in his shadow. The first door he opened was a big one. He got her an audition for the Porter Wagoner Show, one of the most popular country music television programs in America. She got the job, replacing the departing Norma Jean. Almost overnight, Jeannie Seely was on her way. But this initial break came with a silent, unwritten contract. A bargain struck in the smoke-filled offices of Music Row, a bargain rooted in the very core of Hank's being. Remember, Hank was a man whose childhood was defined by chaos, illness, divorce, the cold walls of a children's home. His entire life was a search for stability, and when he couldn't find it, he created it. He controlled his environment. This obsessive need to dominate was his fatal flaw, and ironically, it was also the engine of his greatest work. He didn't just write songs, he built worlds, and he demanded to be the architect. His agreement to help Jeannie was conditional. It was a 1965 understanding, as she would later recall, that he would make her a star if he had total creative control. He would be her champion, her producer, her songwriter, and her gatekeeper. For a woman who had been fighting just to be heard, who had been told her entire career that she was wrong, this seemed like a small price to pay. To trade her creative autonomy for a chance at major success, she took the deal. It would, in time, become the only price that mattered. With this control, Hank set to work. He didn't just want a hit for Jeannie, He wanted to make a statement. He went into his catalog of unrecorded songs, filled with the pain of his past, and he pulled out a masterpiece. It was a song called Don't Touch Me. It was not a simple country love song. It was a raw, sensual, and agonizingly desperate plea. It was the story of a woman so broken by a past love that she cannot bear the simple touch of a new, kind man. It was pure, unfiltered Hank Cochran, complex, adult, and emotionally devastating. He knew instinctively that only Jeannie Seely could sing it. Only her voice, that soulful, world-weary instrument, could convey the song's dangerous mix of desire and damage. He took the demo to every major label on Music Row. And, in a now legendary story of industry blindness, every single one turned it down. They didn't get it. It was too pop for country. It was too country for pop. It was too much. But Hank was not a man who took no for an answer. He was not just a songwriter. He was a true believer. He flew to Rochester, New York, where a Monument Records executive was, and as the story goes, he cornered him and played the verses. He pursued the deal relentlessly. He got Jeannie signed to Monument. The song was recorded and released in 1966. Its impact was immediate. The world had never heard anything like it. Jeannie sang it not as a polite victim, but as a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. You could feel the raw emotion in her voice, the tremor of profound vulnerability. It was the sound of a woman who was starving for love, but terrified of the very thing she needed. The song was a massive hit. It shot to number 2 on the Billboard country chart and even crossed over to the pop charts, hitting number 85. It was a sensation. Miss Country Soul was born. The industry, which had rejected her just a year prior, was now forced to acknowledge her. In 1967, Jeannie Seely did the unthinkable. She won the Grammy Award for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. The hillbilly girl from Pennsylvania, the secretary from Beverly Hills, the woman who wasn't pretty enough, was now a Grammy-winning star. And the man who had orchestrated it all, Hank Cochran, stood in the wings. He had been proven right. His vision was validated. His protégé was a star. And she was, in every sense of the word, his. Even before the Grammy win, her career was rapidly accelerating. She made her first guest performance on the Grand Ole Opry in May 1966. The appearance was so successful that just over a year later, on September 16, 1967, she was officially inducted as a member. To understand what happens next, you have to understand the Opry in the 1960s. It was and is the central institution of country music, but at the time it was also a deeply conservative institution. It was a place of tradition, and that tradition was enforced by an unwritten but ironclad set of rules. For female performers, this meant the gingham curtain, a reference to the modest, gingham-patterned floor-length dresses made famous by stars like Minnie Pearl and Kitty Wells. Jeannie Seely, fresh off her hit and filled with the defiant spirit that had defined her entire life, did not walk on stage in a gingham dress. She walked out in a miniskirt. Let's be clear, this was not a fashion statement. This was an act of cultural warfare. The audience gasped. The traditionalists in the wings were horrified. The Opry manager, Ott Devine, was apoplectic. This was a desecration of his stage. He confronted her, but Jeannie, as always, had her defense ready. She wasn't just a guest, she was a member. She had a contract. She calmly explained that the dress code was an unwritten, unspoken rule, and she was not bound by it. She was a modern woman, and she would dress like one. It was a standoff. And Jeannie won. She shattered the gingham curtain forever. She wasn't just breaking a dress code, she was breaking a gender code. She was claiming her space, not as a polite girl singer defined by men, but as a bold, contemporary artist. She was telling Nashville that the times were changing, whether they liked it or not. Soon, other female artists, bolstered by her courage, began to wear pantsuits and shorter dresses. Jeannie had created an opening, and a generation of women, including future stars like Barbara Mandrell, would follow her example. But this revolution was happening against a backdrop of increasing personal and professional turmoil. Just as Jeannie's star was rising, she was hit with a brutal external rejection. Jeannie left the Porter Wagoner Show in 1966. After a year of searching for a replacement, Porter Wagoner hired a young, bubbly, and then unknown blonde from East Tennessee named Dolly Parton in 1967. For Jeannie, it was a humiliating blow. It reinforced that old stinging insecurity of being second choice. She had replaced Norma Jean, and now she in turn was being replaced. It was a harsh lesson in the fickle nature of show business. This rejection likely had a profound psychological effect. The outside world, represented by Porter Wagoner, was unpredictable and disloyal. It pushed her even further into Hank's creative fortress. The outside world might abandon her, but Hank was constant. Hank was reliable. His control in that moment might have felt less like a cage and more like a shield. Hank capitalized on this new, fragile dynamic. With Jeannie now a full-time recording artist, he became her creative engine. He wrote her first 7 singles. The hits kept coming. I'll Love You More, a top 10 hit in 1967. Welcome Home to Nothing in 1968. He was a hit-making machine, and she was his perfect muse. Their success was so intertwined that in 1968, Jeannie released an entire album dedicated to his work. The title said it all. Thanks, Hank. On the surface, it was a beautiful tribute, a grateful star honoring her mentor. But in retrospect, it was a public declaration of her creative imprisonment. It was a form of gilded confinement. Think about Jeannie's history. This was the woman who had co-written with Randy Newman and Glenn Campbell. This was a smart, ambitious songwriter in her own right. But her own voice, her own Seely style, was being systematically silenced, ironically, by the very man who had given her a platform. Hank wasn't just her mentor anymore. He was her gatekeeper. He was, in effect, her sound. And he tolerated no rivals. He saw all other success as a threat, even from his dead friends. He famously competed for chart space and writing credits with his friend Harlan Howard. And he had a secret weapon, his almost supernatural speed. It's a now famous piece of country music lore that Hank wrote Make the World Go Away, one of the biggest songs of all time, in just 15 minutes after a date at a movie theater. But here's the secret. He hid that fact. He didn't want the world to know it was easy. He cultivated the image of the tortured artist, the man who bled onto the page, because he knew that in Nashville, pain sold better than ease. By 1968, they were the most potent and most complicated creative duo in town. Hank had proven his genius for a new decade. Jeannie had become a Grammy-winning miniskirt-wearing icon of the Opry. He, the man who fled a children's home, had finally built a family he could control. She, the woman told she wasn't pretty enough, had become an undeniable star. Their professional alliance was unbreakable. Their creative chemistry was electric. The next logical step seemed inevitable. They weren't just partners in music anymore. They were falling in love. Or perhaps they were falling into the narrative they had created for themselves. On June 15, 1969, they made their partnership official. Hank Cochran, in his 4th marriage, and Jeannie Seely, in her 1st, were wed at a ceremony in Renfro Valley, Kentucky. The press hailed them as the new power couple of country music. But as they stood at the altar, they weren't just beginning a marriage. They were escalating a war. The battle for creative control once confined to the studio, was now moving into their home. Their creative partnership was about to become a personal battleground. On June 15th, 1969, Hank Cochran and Jeannie Seely stood at an altar in Renfro Valley, Kentucky. This was not just a wedding. It was a public acknowledgement of their status. It was the king of Heartbreak marrying Miss Country Soul. It was his fourth attempt at the stability he so desperately craved, and her first leap of faith. The press, the industry, the fans, they all saw a power couple, the perfect fusion of the writer and the voice, the ultimate creative partnership now sealed by law and by love. And for a time, they were everything the world wanted them to be. The early 1970s brought immense success. Immediately after their marriage, Jeannie's career went into overdrive. She signed a new high-profile contract with Decca Records. The hits, many penned by Hank, continued, but Jeannie was also building an empire of her own. They embarked on a tour of East Asia, performing for American troops. It was here that Jeannie's pioneer spirit exploded onto the world stage. She became the first female DJ on the Armed Forces Network. Think about that. In the midst of the Vietnam War, at a time of immense global tension, it was Jeannie Seely's warm, soulful voice that broadcast across the airwaves to 4 million listeners, a comforting sound of home in a time of chaos. She wasn't just Hank's girl singer anymore. She was a global ambassador of country music in her own right. Then came the partnership that would define this era for her, a partnership that would, ironically, create the rift that led to her marriage's destruction. Jeannie teamed up with fellow Opry star Jack Green. Their chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Their first duet, Wish I Didn't Have to Miss You, shot to number 5 on the charts and earned them a Grammy nomination. The world was clamoring for them. They toured the country's most prestigious venues, from Madison Square Garden in New York to Wembley Arena in London. Between 1972 and 1975, Jeannie and Jack were nominated for the Country Music Association's Vocal Duo of the Year award 4 consecutive times. Jeannie was no longer just a star. She was a certified superstar, one half of the hottest duo in the genre. And what about Hank? He was at his own peak. In 1972, he penned It's Not Love for Merle Haggard, a song that went straight to number 1. He was the most respected songwriter in town, and his wife was one of its biggest stars. In 1975, they built their dream, a sprawling 77-acre farm in Hendersonville, Tennessee. It was the ultimate symbol of their success. It was the ultimate symbol of stability, a physical representation of the permanence that Hank, the boy from the children's home, had sought his entire life. They were, by every metric, the king and queen of Nashville. But in the grand, empty rooms of that farmhouse, their relationship was deteriorating. The problem was simple. Hank Cochran, the man whose psychological engine ran on a desperate need for creative control, was now married to a woman who was having massive success without him. The 4 CMA nominations Jeannie received were not with Hank Cochran. They were with Jack Green. For a man as complex and insecure as Hank, this was not a shared victory. It was a threat. He, the mentor, was being overshadowed. His creation, his Miss Country Soul, was proving she didn't need him to write her hits or sing her harmonies. His insecurity, amplified by her independent triumph and a growing dependency on alcohol, began to poison the relationship. He viewed her chart success as a defection. He felt that because he had built her career, he held the proprietary right to dictate its direction. He insisted she record his songs, often passing on other material that could have been hits. He grew resentful of her time on the road with Jack Green. Jeannie was now trapped in an impossible position. She was now facing conflict both publicly and privately. Publicly, she was fighting the sexist infrastructure of the music industry. She would later recall how promoters would consistently and illegally pay Jack Green more than her for the same show. They saw her as the girl singer and him as the star, despite their equal billing. She fought them for every dollar, for every ounce of respect. But privately, she was fighting a more insidious battle at home. She would return from the road, victorious from her battles with promoters, only to face the jealous fury of her own husband. Hank's control, which had once been her shield, was now being used as a weapon. Her success with Jack Green wasn't a shared victory. In his eyes, it was an act of rebellion. The Golden Cage had now officially become a battleground, and beneath all this was another, more personal and deeply hidden tragedy: the pressure of childlessness. Jeannie was a loving and devoted stepmother to Hank's 3 children from his previous marriage. But in the hyper-familial world of 1970s, Nashville, a marriage was often cemented by children. As Jeannie would reveal in a poignant 2024 interview, there was an unspoken pressure, a silent grief about their inability to have a child together. That 77-acre farm, that symbol of stability, was also a grand empty nest. The tension was suffocating. Hank's drinking, a demon he'd wrestled with for years, escalated. It was no longer social. It was a medicine for his insecurity. The power couple was rotting from the inside out. They were staying together, but they were living a lie. And then in the cold of January 1977, the lie was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and breaking glass. Jeannie was driving near her home in Goodlettsville when her car skidded off an icy road and crashed. The accident was horrifically violent. When the paramedics arrived, they found her broken. Her jaw was shattered. Multiple ribs were cracked. And, most terrifyingly for a singer, a broken rib had punctured her lung. She was rushed into emergency surgery. Her life and her career were in critical condition. The news shocked Nashville. One of her first visitors in the intensive care unit was her friend, the legendary Dottie West. Dottie, seeing Jeannie's spirit crushed, allegedly looked at her, and with the tough love that only a true friend can give, helped pull her back from the brink, reminding her of the fighter she was. Jeannie survived, but the woman who left that hospital was not the same one who had entered. The accident was a brutal physical manifestation of the psychological prison she had been in. She had been physically broken, just as she was being emotionally broken at home. The recovery was long and agonizing. She battled a deep temporary depression. The trauma of the crash had done what no record executive or jealous husband could do. It had silenced her, if only for a moment. The marriage, already crumbling under the weight of jealousy and alcohol, could not survive this final catastrophic blow. The dynamic was now permanently altered. The power couple was now the survivor and the drunk, a harsh reality that no amount of hit songs could disguise. They limped along for another 2 years, but the magic was gone. Jeannie, in a last-ditch effort, signed with a new label, Columbia, in 1978. Her song titles from this period are not just songs, they are a public diary of her private hell. She released a song titled "Take Me to Bed." It wasn't a sultry invitation, it was a desperate, almost cynical plea for a connection that was long gone. Then she released a song titled "We're Still Hanging in There, Ain't We, Jessie?" It was a song about the troubled public marriages of country stars, a direct and painful nod to her own life with Hank. She was quite literally singing her own divorce papers to the world. It wasn't enough. In 1979, the music finally stopped. Jeannie Seely filed for divorce from Hank Cochran. The great creative partnership of the decade was over. The marriage born from a promise of creative freedom had died by the poison of creative control. Jeannie was free, but she was also a woman in her late 30s, a survivor of a life-altering accident, with a career now unmoored from the man who had, for better and for worse, defined it. Hank had laid the groundwork, but he had also built a trap. Now the trap was open, but the world outside was a cold, unfamiliar, and uncertain place. After the divorce was finalized in 1979, what was left was a professional and personal void. The power couple was dead. The creative engine that had defined a decade was now just two separate, sputtering parts. For Hank Cochran and Jeannie Seely, the 1980s were not a continuation. It was an amputation. They now had to learn to work separately, while the memory of their shared past lingered in every studio and every stage in Nashville. Hank, the man who craved stability above all else, did what he always did. He immediately built a new fortress. In 1982, he married Susie, his fifth and final wife. He found the stable partnership he had been searching for his entire life, and with that stability, his creative genius, no longer distracted by the war at home, was unleashed in a way that would define the entire decade. For Jeannie, the path was not so clear. She was no longer Mrs. Hank Cochran. She was no longer the muse. She was a woman of 40, a survivor of a brutal accident, in an industry that prizes youth and discards yesterday's stars. Her fight for survival, the one she thought she had won, was only just beginning. For Hank Cochran, the 1980s were a resurrection. Free from the emotional turmoil of his marriage to Jeannie, he solidified his status as not just a songwriter, but as the songwriter. He became the undisputed dean of Nashville songwriters. His first act of this new era was a masterpiece. He had always been a champion for his old friend, Willie Nelson. In 1980, he co-produced and starred in Willie's film Honeysuckle Rose. The accompanying soundtrack album, which Hank heavily contributed to, was not just a hit. It was a cultural phenomenon. It flew to #1 on the country charts, went platinum, and cemented the outlaw sound as a mainstream force. Hank wasn't just writing songs. He was shaping the entire direction of the genre. This was the era of the new traditionalists, a wave of young artists looking to reclaim the classic country sound. And who better to guide them than the man who had helped invent it? In 1985, Hank sat down with a young, talented, but still unproven songwriter named Dean Dillon. Together they channeled Hank's classic Heartbreak ethos. The result was a song called The Chair. It was vintage Hank, a clever, simple, emotionally devastating narrative. It landed in the hands of a young Texan named George Strait. The song became a massive #1 hit, one of the signature songs of Strait's legendary career. The hits just kept coming, a relentless display of his enduring genius. Miami, My Amy for the tragic, brilliant Keith Whitley in 1986. Don't You Ever Get Tired, an old song given new life as a #1 smash for Ronnie Millsap. But perhaps his crowning achievement of the decade, the one that truly captured his genius but tortured soul, was his collaboration with Vern Gosdin. In 1988, they released Chiseled in Stone. The album was a raw, unfiltered masterpiece of adult heartbreak, and the title track, co-written by Gosdin, became a #7 hit, the biggest of Gosdin's career. It was a song so painful, so true, that it became an anthem for the divorced, the grieving, and the broken. It was pure Hank Cochran, delivered through the voice of a man who sounded just as scarred. Hank had achieved something few artists ever do, a second and arguably more profound golden age. He had been inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1974, but the 80s proved it wasn't a fluke. He was the standard. But the tortured part of his genius was never far from the surface. The secret that he had guarded, the demon he had wrestled with during his marriage to Jeannie, was still his constant companion, alcohol. His collaborators knew it. Vern Gosden would later refer to Hank as a genius, but tortured, a quiet nod to the man who would show up to writing sessions with a mind full of brilliance and a body full of booze. It was the price he paid. The same childhood trauma that gave him his lyrical depth also fueled his self-destruction. The boy who was told he wouldn't live past his teens was in many ways still living like it, burning the candle at both ends, because he never truly believed the dawn would come. And then, the prophecy of his childhood began to reemerge. The body that had survived pneumonia, measles, mumps, and whooping cough all at once was, at last, beginning to break down. In 2003, he released Remembering Patsy Cline, a tribute to his first great muse. It was a tender personal project, a collaboration with jazz singer Leah Ann Creswell, reportedly born from his and Patsy's shared love of Nat King Cole. It felt like a man looking back, settling his accounts. In 2008, the news that those closest to him had dreaded finally came. Hank Cochran was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was now in a fight for his own life. He underwent surgery, a brutal, invasive procedure. The ultimate survivor was facing a challenge he could not overcome. He and Susie retreated, focusing on his health, his friends rallying around him. His time was finally and truly running out. The man who had written the soundtrack to 1,000 Endings was about to write his own. While Hank was reconquering the charts, Jeannie Seely was in a street fight. Her post-divorce reality was a brutal education in 1980s industry politics. Her first move was to lean on her own connections. She made a cameo appearance in Honeysuckle Rose, her ex-husband's film project with Willie Nelson. She even toured as part of Willie's Willie and Family entourage. It was work, but it was also a stark reminder she was no longer the headliner. She was a supporting player. The most painful blow came from her greatest success. Her partnership with Jack Green was her own, separate from Hank. It was her triumph. But when she tried to re-establish the duo after the divorce, she learned a bitter lesson. As she later recounted, the promoters, almost exclusively male, had always been loyal to Jack. They saw him as the star, her as the add-on. Now that she was unattached, they simply didn't return her calls. The duo and the financial security it represented was finished. Jeannie was a fighter. If the music industry wouldn't give her a stage, she would build her own. In 1985, she made a move of incredible, perhaps reckless ambition. She poured her resources into opening her own nightclub in Nashville, the Nashville Palace. It was a massive gamble. For a brief shining year, she was the Miss Mona of her own establishment, a boss, an entrepreneur. But the business is notoriously fickle. The club, a financial drain, closed after just 1 year. She was in her mid-40s, a Grammy winner, an Opry legend, and she was, for all intents and purposes, financially ruined and professionally adrift. This is the moment that truly defines Jeannie Seely. This is where the Miss Country Soul persona was forged, not in a studio, but in the crucible of failure. A lesser person would have quit, faded into nostalgia, become a where are they now story. Jeannie Seely went to the theater. She didn't just pivot, she reinvented herself from the ground up. She wasn't just a singer anymore, she was an actress. She took on a role in the stage play, Taking It Home, performing alongside the mother of a future country star, Lori Morgan. Then, in a brilliant piece of casting, she took on the role she was born to play. Miss Mona in the best little whorehouse in Texas. She wasn't just singing songs. She was inhabiting a character, a tough, pragmatic, heart of gold woman who simply refused to be broken. Sound familiar? But her greatest triumph of this era was also the source of her greatest secret. In 1990, she was starring as the lead Opal in the play Everybody Loves Opal. It was a physically demanding role. During one rehearsal, she fell. The pain was sharp, immediate. She had broken a rib. Now stop and think. This is the woman who, in 1977, had her lungs punctured by broken ribs in a car crash that nearly killed her. The psychological terror of that re-injury must have been overwhelming. The doctors told her to rest, to recover. Quitting was the sane, logical, and medically advised option. Jeannie Seely put on her costume, stepped onto the stage, and performed the entire run of the show with a broken rib. This was the secret she kept, a fact she wouldn't reveal until a 2019 interview. It is the single greatest metaphor for her life. She was a woman who would not be broken. She would perform through the pain. She had always performed through the pain, through the hillbilly taunts, the not pretty enough rejections, the controlling marriage, the sexist promoters. This was just one more battle. This resilience defined the next phase of her career. She was no longer waiting for a label to call. In the 1990s, she took control of her own music, self-producing her own albums like Jeannie Seely and Number One Christmas. She released Been There, Sung That. In 1999, a defiant title if there ever was one, which featured a duet with her old friend, Willie Nelson. She was everywhere. She appeared in a Confederate Railroad music video. She returned to the stage, this time as Louise Sager, the friend and confidant in the beloved play Always Patsy Cline. A poignant nod, considering Hank's connection to the legend. She even appeared in the 2002 film Changing Hearts. She had become an institution. The miniskirt-wearing rebel had become the pantsuit-wearing matriarch of the Opry. She was a mentor, a survivor, a producer, an actress. She had built a legacy entirely separate from Hank Cochran. The year 2010 arrived, a year that would bring a final tragic convergence of their separate paths. In May, a historic flood devastated Nashville. Water levels rose with catastrophic speed, swallowing homes, studios, and the Grand Ole Opry itself. Jeannie Seely's home, the one she had painstakingly rebuilt after her divorce, was directly in its path. She lost everything. Decades of memorabilia, Grammy Awards, stage outfits, photographs, every physical piece of her history, gone, swallowed by the muddy water. She was once again left with nothing but the clothes on her back. And yet, when a reporter found her, she did not weep. She looked at the wreckage of her life, and with that same Pennsylvania farm girl grit, she smiled and gave one of the most iconic quotes of her life. She said, "I've been in the dark before, but I always know there's a neon light at the end of the tunnel." She was, as always, a survivor. But as Jeannie was wading through the ruins of her home, her past was coming to a definitive end. Across town, Hank Cochran was losing his final battle. The pancreatic cancer was relentless. In early 2010, he underwent surgery for an aortic aneurysm, a catastrophic complication. His body, the one that had been a medical miracle at age 3, was finally, at 74, giving up. He was surrounded by his family, his wife Susie at his side. He died on July 15th, 2010. The genius who had penned the soundtrack for a generation, the tortured survivor of a brutal childhood, the man who had discovered Jeannie Seely and in his desperate need for control had almost destroyed her, was silent. For Jeannie, it was a profound, complex loss. She had lost her mentor, her greatest champion, her ex-husband, and her most profound artistic rival, all in one man. The flood had washed away her present, and Hank's death had severed her last link to the past that had defined her. She was 70 years old, homeless, and now truly on her own. The final act of her life, the one she would live without Hank in the world, was about to begin. The death of Hank Cochran was the end of an era. The flood of 2010 was the end of a life. For Jeannie Seely, left at 70 years old amidst the muddy wreckage of her home, her past washed away, and the man who had been her greatest champion and her most profound antagonist gone from the world, this could have been an abyss. It could have been the final crushing blow in a life defined by a relentless series of them. But the world had forgotten who Jeannie Seely was. They saw the Opry legend, but they had forgotten the hillbilly girl who was bullied in the schoolyard. The young woman told she wasn't pretty enough for Nashville, the wife who endured control, the star who fought sexist promoters, and the actress who performed for weeks with a broken rib. This was not an ending for Jeannie. It was a liberation. With Hank's shadow, as a mentor, a husband, a rival, and a ghost, finally lifted, the story was no longer theirs. It was, for the first time in 45 years, unequivocally hers. As Nashville began to rebuild from the flood, Jeannie rebuilt her life. And while Hank Cochran's name was being immortalized, his legacy was also being analyzed. In 2012, the tribute album Live In for a Song was released. It was a massive star-studded affair, featuring Jamie Johnson, Vince Gill, and even a new generation like Miranda Lambert, all paying homage to the king of Heartbreak. The album was a critical and commercial smash, debuting at #1 on the country charts. It was a powerful reminder of the sheer depth of his catalog. Then, in 2014, the ultimate honor, Hank Cochran was posthumously inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a validation of everything he had ever worked for. His daughter, and even Jeannie herself, spoke of his genius, his complexity. But his induction also served to highlight the secret of his career, the one he had guarded so closely. The fact that he'd written "Make the World Go Away in 15 Minutes" was now celebrated as proof of his effortless divine talent. His legacy was secure, but while Hank's story was being memorialized, Jeannie's was still being written, and it was being written in her voice. She released Vintage Country in 2011, a loving look back at the songs that had inspired her. In 2016, she stepped into a new role, hosting the Dottie West Bash, honoring the friend who had sat by her hospital bed after her 1977 accident. She wasn't just a performer anymore. She was a presence. Then in 2017 came the album that was her definitive statement, written in song. For the first time in a long time, the album was almost entirely self-penned. She was no longer singing Hank's words or anyone else's. She was singing her words. The songwriter who had co-written with Randy Newman all those decades ago was finally, fully back. The industry that had once shunned her now rushed to embrace her. In 2018, she was inducted into the Music City Walk of Fame. That same year, she launched her own radio show on Sirius XM, Sundays with Seely. Her warm, wise, and witty voice now traveled to millions, not as a DJ for the armed forces, but as the matriarch of the entire genre. She had become the living, breathing, pantsuit-wearing conscience of the Grand Ole Opry. She was the one who mentored young artists like Carly Pearce, who openly cited Jeannie's miniskirt rebellion as the inspiration for her own fashion and attitude. She was the one who held the record, a staggering, unbreakable record of over 5,300 performances on the Opry stage. She wasn't just a member, she was the Opry. In 2019, she received an honorary doctorate from Lincoln Memorial University and was a key voice in Ken Burns' definitive country music documentary. her sharp, insightful commentary, proving she was not just a subject of history, but one of its most intelligent narrators. In 2020, at 80 years old, she released an American classic on Curb Records, a stunningly vital album that featured duets with her old friends Willie Nelson and Vince Gill. It was a critical triumph. She had survived Hank. She had survived the flood. She had survived the industry. She had finally and completely won. But even for the ultimate survivor, time remains the one unbeatable foe. As Jeannie was ascending to her greatest heights as a solo icon, her personal life was dealt one last devastating blow. Her husband, Gene Ward, a man who had been her quiet anchor for years, was diagnosed with cancer. She had stood by him, just as they had stood by each other, even renewing their wedding vows on a cruise in 2019. On December 13th, 2024, Jean passed away. The loss was profound. For the first time in her adult life, Jeannie Seely was truly alone. The combination of grief and a lifetime of pushing her body to its limits began to take its toll. Just 3 months later, in March 2025, the 84-year-old icon underwent a serious and complicated back surgery. The recovery was not what she had hoped. In May, she was readmitted to the hospital, this time with a severe case of pneumonia. She was a fighter, as always, and was moved to a rehabilitation facility to try and regain her strength. But the body that had survived the hillbilly taunts, the car crash, and the broken rib on stage was finally, truly exhausted. On August 1st, 2025, Jeannie Seely died from complications of an intestinal infection at TriStar Summit Medical Center. She was 85 years old. The news hit Nashville like a physical blow. The neon light at the end of the tunnel had finally gone out. The Opry stage was dark. The next night, August 2nd, which would have been Hank Cochran's 90th birthday, the Grand Ole Opry held a tearful, emotional tribute. Her empty microphone stood at center stage. Her friend Dolly Parton, a woman who had once been her rival for the Porter Wagoner job and had become one of her dearest friends, released a statement that captured the heart of the world. Jeannie was my dearest friend. We shared so many laughs and so many tears. It's hard to imagine Nashville without her. She was pure country and pure soul. She died, as some reports noted, in the ICU, a lonely inn for a woman who lived her life in the spotlight. But in truth, she died having achieved everything she had ever set out to do, and on her own terms. How, then, should history ultimately remember the intertwined story of Hank Cochran and Jeannie Seely? Individually, they are giants. Hank Cochran is, without question, one of the 20th century's greatest songwriters. He was a pluperfect poet of pain, a man who gave voice to the brokenhearted. His 29 top 10 hits and his 2014 induction into the Hall of Fame are merely footnotes to his true impact. He, along with his friend Harlan Howard, taught Nashville how to bleed on a record. Jeannie Seely is a pioneer in the truest sense of the word. Known as Miss Country Soul, she was a vocal innovator who brought a raw, bluesy realism to the genre. She was a feminist trailblazer who shattered the Opry's dress code and fought the industry's sexist double standards. Her record-breaking 5,397 Opry performances are a testament to her incredible endurance, and her final decade of work, the Sirius XM show, the critically acclaimed albums, proved that a woman's voice only gets more powerful with age. But their shared legacy is more complex. It's a dark and beautiful bi-tragedy. Their relationship from 1965 to 1979 was a microcosm of Nashville itself, a story of creative genius inextricably linked with male control and a woman's fight for autonomy. Their music, born from this conflict, was transcendent. Don't Touch Me is not just a great song, it's a perfect storm. Hank's wounded, controlling genius found its only perfect vessel in Jeannie's defiant, soulful survivor voice. Theirs was a relationship of profound contradictions. He was the one who discovered her and the one who tried to imprison her. She was the one who revered him as a mentor and the one who had to flee from him as a husband. In the end, Hank Cochran and Jeannie Seely's story is not a simple love story. It's not even a simple divorce story. It's the story of what it costs to make art. It's about the beauty that can be born from the most profound, painful, and controlling conflicts. They were a power couple, yes, but they were also a creative war. And in that war, everyone and no one won. But the music they made, that music endures.